Mollie Hemingway, senior editor at the Federalist, and I am joined by Sean Davis, co-founder of the Federalist. How are you doing, Sean?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right, except that you promised me that you were going to wear a t-shirt that you are not wearing. You're wearing a wonderful t-shirt. I like it. It's from our new Federalist collection. But you promised something much more delightful, and I'm wondering what happened.
I did. See, the problem with this camera angle is you can't even get the full shirt on. So here, this says the Federalist Salt Mining Company. We're in the salt biz now. And so I thought, I need to wear something that has the Federalist on it. Now, what I had planned on wearing is what I call the greatest t-shirt that has ever been made ever. And it's a miniature dachshund riding a unicorn into a rainbow. So I had planned on wearing that, but then it would have ended up like, you just see this. And then it's like, that's stupid. No, you need that.
That is an amazing shirt. I particularly like the flowy rainbow mane on the unicorn.
Also, the dog, he's been working out a bit. Like that's a jacked miniature dachshund. Normally they're just kind of fat and they lay around, but that one he's been active during the Rona.
Did you design this shirt yourself?
I did not. I don't have that kind of design ability.
Okay. So how was your Independence Day?
It was awesome. We freedomed pretty hard.
Good.
Did some fireworks, celebrated America, listened to a crap ton of Lee Greenwood, and it was lovely.
And what did you think of the president's Independence Day address?
I thought it was awesome. I think it's probably the greatest speech he has ever given. He defended America and he defended our ideals, and I wish that would be the rest of his campaign for the rest of the election. It's just defending America and making clear that what's at stake this year is our Constitution and our freedom and our country. It's not about Trump. It's not about Biden. It's whether you believe in America.
Yeah, it was interesting to be online on Friday night when the speech was given, because it was just received sort of positively by a wide variety of people. You know, people saying, I don't like Trump, but this is a great speech, or this was the full-throated defense of American values that I've been waiting for someone to give, or people who are Trump fans just saying this is awesome and this is why I like this guy. And you saw that from a wide variety of people, but then what happened?
Well, then the media got involved, and they're a bunch of dirty, corrupt liars. Some might call them the enemy of the people. But yeah, you had Trump, who gives this just wonderful, historic defense of America, talking about our heroes and the people and the ideals that made this country great. It had all of my favorite things. It had a lot of America. It had fireworks. It had flyovers. Like, it was awesome. Every red-blooded American should love it. And instead, the media came out and called it dark and divisive, which I guess if you hate America, somebody saying America's awesome is divisive, but they're just awful, dirty liars, and they're literally the worst.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but yes. It was interesting because the week leading up to this speech, you had major media outlets doing these divisive things like decrying founding fathers, supporting statue desecration of people, far beyond Confederate figures, people lamenting Mount Rushmore, a place that they formerly loved when Democratic politicians visited, but now apparently needs to be destroyed. And you saw this in major media. And then when President Trump talked about cancel culture and this move to destroy American history, everyone was like, what's he talking about? We've never heard of such a thing. He's saying these peaceful protesters who would never hurt a fly and there's been no violence anywhere are bad. And he's talking about history destruction, and they were acting like he was just making stuff up when they themselves had been part of it. It was very weird to see the level of gaslighting. And really, I think personally, it went well beyond gaslighting. So I think people are kind of used to seeing the media behave poorly when they are supposed to be reporting on events. This was the first time I saw sort of an all hands on deck, we have to lie about what happened kind of thing. And I think that step into just unbridled lying was very significant and cannot be downplayed. Just in general, I know that conservative concern about media bias literally goes back to Eisenhower. And 2016 was seen as a really bad election for media bias in terms of just how completely out of touch media figures were and how they didn't understand the fundamentals of the election, how they kept on sort of exaggerating or putting the worst construction on things Republicans said. This is something altogether different. It's like the guardrails are completely off. Whatever they had been, however they had been used before to keep people from just completely going off the side of the road, that's just gone. And if it's like you need to lie about it, that's fine. If you need to deny what was in your own newspaper the day before, that's fine. Whatever it takes to defeat the bad orange man apparently will be supported, tolerated, and encouraged by many major media figures.
Right. It was kind of shocking. I feel like we've been conditioned to a whole bunch of media lies, whether it was the Russia hoax or pretty much anything, the coronavirus, the protests and the riots. They've lied about anything. And now when they do it and they take it to the level they did after that speech, I'm not sure they even watched it. It was such a coordinated response from across the left that I almost wonder if just a memo went out and said, yeah, you're just going to call it dark and divisive. Like before Kavanaugh was nominated, you had all the left-wing groups saying, we oppose whoever the nominee is. I feel like it was that sort of like Mad Lib template that they used. But yeah, I think the most destructive force, the most destructive institution in America today is the media. And it's not because they believe different things that we believe. That's fine. It's that they will lie about literally anything. They'll go out and say, like Baghdad Bob in front of the airport when tanks are rolling in the back during the Iraq War. Yeah, there's no tanks in Baghdad. They'll go and they'll have people behind them setting cop cars on fire and be like, yeah, these riots are super peaceful and there's definitely not any cop cars on fire.
There was that great video image, I think it was Ali Velshi at MSNBC being like, everything's pretty peaceful here, with like burning buildings in the background of the live shot. And it was like, I'm not sure your visual is communicating what you want it to be communicating. But yeah, I think it's more interesting to think about why the media are lying rather than discuss that they are. We all see that they are. That is a very, very serious problem, particularly for an industry that wants to say that any criticism of it is a threat to freedom of the press. I think that it's not that difficult to understand why they decided to resort to this. And it's that they understand that sort of the moral high ground is not held by people who are toppling statues of Frederick Douglass or Thomas Jefferson or George Washington in the middle of the night, or Elks, or people have nothing to do with the stated claims of the current street protests. They know they don't have the moral high ground, and they know that far from what they communicate in their pages and on their TV programs, that these violent mobs are not viewed as favorably outside of cloistered newsrooms as they are within cloistered newsrooms, and that it's a very effective campaign message. I mean, it's kind of obvious point, but an effective campaign message to defend America, her heroes, her founding fathers, her ideals, and they wanted to do whatever it took to stop that effective campaign message from taking root, because our media have moved from reporting on events into just being the most powerful, unaccountable political activists in our country right now.
Right. It reminded me after Trump ordered the bombing or the droning of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian terrorist leader, which was a great day in America, or when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed by special forces overseas. They lionized him as an austere religious scholar. Like, they will take anything that they know is good news for America, which ends up being good news for the president, and they'll just take a dump all over it, or they won't report it, or they'll distort the facts. And it might have been you who said it on Twitter. You can tell how successful and how moving Trump's speech was at Mount Rushmore by how brazenly they lied about it.
Now, I would like to just mention the awesomeness of the Mount Rushmore backdrop. And we were talking last week about what an important location that was in one of our favorite movies, which is Team America.
Oh, yeah.
And Mount Rushmore is where the headquarters of the Team America team is. And you might recall that in this puppet movie, so it's a movie where puppets play a major
Mollie,
part.
let's give it its due. It's a film.
It's a film.
It belongs in the American pantheon of cinema.
it's a film that perfectly encapsulates my foreign policy. So I've always held it really near and dear to my heart. But the Mount Rushmore itself comes under attack from domestic enemies in the form of a Michael Moore puppet who suicide bombs himself in Mount Rushmore, which is where where the operations are taking place, and causes like major devastation in the area. And in the movie, there are all these like fighter jets flying into Mount Rushmore. And so there was that great shot of the jets flying past Mount Rushmore, and it looked like
it looked amazing. Yeah, seeing the Blue
like
Angels streaking across.
Film there.
Well, yeah, so I think Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the guys behind South Park, are the most brilliant satirists in America. At least I used to think that. Now I think they have some sort of freaky power to see the future, because it was supposed to be a joke that a hot dog pounding Michael Moore would show up at Mount Rushmore with mustard all over his face, clad in a suicide vest, and then blow it up. And yet here we are like 15, 20 years later, and what they thought was funny because it was so over the top is now being
printed in the pages of the New York Times.
Yeah, it's now the mainstream position of the far left Democratic Party. And so, I mean, we can joke about it a little bit because it's so absurd, but it's actually really, really sad that defending America, the country that gives us all these opportunities, is now seen as a countercultural subversive act. And that's sad.
Yes. And in general, this is something I think that has been so horrifying to see in just a month, the amount of destruction wrought under the guise or name of Black Lives Matter political movement, but one that hasn't been looked at critically at all. Like everyone just rushed, every corporation rushed to give money to Black Lives Matter political movement, to assert that they were totally aligned with their values. And nobody really decided to look into that movement or anything behind the slogan to see what was there. And we're seeing sort of all these problems in cities across the country from the implementation of the ideas behind this movement, whether it's decrying police, defunding police, abolishing police, decrying the family where father and mother with children are, that the father and mother are married to each other, and all these sort of radical positions that many people in the media and corporations, all the elites, just immediately said, "Oh yeah, we're totally on board with this." And to see how quickly sort of this destruction is wrought is alarming.
It's sad. It's I have some props here, if our viewers and listeners will indulge me. We've got 1984. George Orwell and Animal Farm. And what we're seeing now is if Animal Farm and 1984 went and got drunk and got busy, and then ta-da, their baby is modern progressivism. Like, these were not supposed to be instruction manuals. Okay, these are supposed to be warnings. And yet, whether it's the masks where you have people saying, oh, you have to wear a mask, but I don't have to wear one if I'm protesting things I don't like, because that's different, because the Rona is super smart. And it can't get you if you're 6.5 feet away, and also if your moral and political ideologies are pure. So you have the Animal Farm bit there, where some animals are more equal than others. And then you have 1984, where the whole deconstruction of everything that came before the ruling regime is required, so that the regime can build everything up from the ground up, similar to what Mao did in the Cultural Revolution. There's a line in 1984 that, we were always at war with East Asia. Like, it didn't matter what happened a minute prior. History forever was what happened right now. And that's what all the iconoclasm is about. It's not about Confederates. It's not about statues. It's destroying the foundation of America. That's the whole point, so that they can rebuild America in their own image, under their own power, according to their own ideals.
Right. And I think that the statue destruction movement quickly moved on from Confederate statues, which are, people reasonably have negative views about these statues, even if a majority of Americans don't think they should be torn down as part of our history and whatnot. And it moved so quickly on from that into the Founding Fathers. And what was interesting is it wasn't just the statue destroyers who were toppling the Founding Fathers. It was mainstream media and prominent pundits defending the destruction of these statues. I think it's the New York Times has a piece from a descendant of Thomas Jefferson saying that a statue to him should be torn down and replaced with Harriet Tubman, as if there's like a zero-sum game on statues and that you can never build a new one until you destroy an old one, and that's what has to happen in order for a statue to Harriet Tubman to be erected in Washington, D.C., when, of course, that's an absurd proposal. And it's absurd to say that a descendant of, like a biological descendant of Thomas Jefferson, gets to decide whether a country honors someone who's responsible for the protection of our natural rights encoded in our founding documents.
Right. If somebody who's by chance of fate shares similar DNA to someone who did something 250 years ago has like this moral authority to demand things. I'm sorry, we're not Great Britain. We're America. We don't believe in hereditary monarchies. So you can just get rid of that nonsense right now.
Okay, so moving on from that sad state of affairs that's happening in the streets across the country, we also had a story in recent weeks about the New York Times broke news based on criminal leaks from completely anonymous sources to the same reporters who pushed the completely false Russia collusion hoax. And the story was that Donald Trump had been extensively briefed on on Russians offering bounties to the Taliban for dead Americans, and that there may have been success with this plot, unclear, and that Donald Trump did nothing. Now, it turned out that was false, that he hadn't been briefed, and the story just kind of kept on moving the goalposts. But I still think it's an interesting story, and not just because, you know, you don't want to see anyone placing bounties on American soldiers. What did you think of the story?
It's interesting. So when I first heard it and heard the main allegation that the Russians were trying to do bad things in Afghanistan, I thought, well, yeah, they've been doing bad things to us in Afghanistan for 20 years because that's how long we've been there. So yeah, the government there is evil. They do bad things. They do bad things everywhere. Of course, they're trying to do that. I thought it was weird that somehow it was viewed as this like groundbreaking, shocking thing that nobody had ever contemplated until like a month ago. I just thought it was so silly that I kind of dismissed it. And then after that, I kind of moved to, well, you know, if you don't want Russians and a bunch of our enemies targeting us in a country we've been in for 19 years with no plan for victory and no way to get out, maybe we just don't be there. Okay, if you're worried about casualties in Afghanistan and you don't think they're worth the cost of what they're trying to achieve there, there's a real easy way out of that. And it's maybe after 19 years, we decide, you know what, we're going to focus on our priorities at home and stop trying to rebuild a completely backwards nation that has absolutely no interest in us being there. But that's just me.
So you and I did extensive and completely awesome work on the Russia collusion hoax. That was based largely on criminal leaks that were designed to set a false narrative. Now, it all crumbled in the end with the realization that not only had Donald Trump not conspired with Russians to steal the 2016 election, no one on his campaign had conspired with Russians to steal the election. And in fact, there's no evidence of a single American in America conspiring with the Russians to steal an election. But for many years, we had these criminal leaks that were put out there to really seal in the minds of people that there was Russia collusion. And that actually worked very, very effectively. Majority of Democrats actually believe something that's not true, this conspiracy theory. And the media are in no mood to correct it since they were co-conspirators in this operation. But what you and I learned by covering this story is that leaks always happen for a reason. Now, the reason isn't always the same. I mean, it can be really petty, like someone's trying to rise up in one office over another person, or, major. They're actually trying to harm national security, or they're trying to harm the duly elected president. It can be major, it can be minor. This story was so poorly put out through those same Russia collusion hoaxers that I did immediately wonder, what's the aim here? And I do think attempt to keep the country in Afghanistan for another 19 years could be one of the aims of the people, particularly because you and I know a little bit about who is believed to be behind these leaks and what their financial or personal motivations might be. But what else might it be? Do you think there's something? I mean, it was kind of such an absurd and poorly done operation that that died. I wonder if we should think through what the motivation is. But before you answer that, could you also tell people what our breaking news was on that story?
Well, yeah. So what we learned through kind of talking through our networks and looking at the facts is that Adam Schiff and his top staff were actually briefed on this so-called blockbuster intelligence in Afghanistan back in February. And you would think, wow, they were going after Trump, saying that he didn't tell anyone and he didn't do anything, and this was treason and this was criminal. So you would assume that when Schiff's staff and the Democrat head of the House Intelligence Committee learned this, that he would have rushed to tell the committee, hold hearings, brief Congress, tell the president he needed to do something. But if you thought that, you would be mistaken, because he did absolutely nothing. They did nothing in February. They did nothing in March. There were no hearings in April. There were no briefings in May. They did nothing, which ought to tell you how the so-called intelligence community might have viewed this information as being not exactly worthy of really acting on.
Right. So when we broke that story about Schiff's top aides being briefed, I think people thought that maybe Schiff was involved in the leak campaign, which was not
never
based on his past behavior. But I think what it actually shows is that, unfortunately, Russians are engaged in malign behavior, just like Iran in 2010 was accused of offering bounties to the Taliban in Afghanistan. And on that note, in 2010, Iran was accused of offering bounties. Our response to that was to give them, $1.4 billion in cash and to help them with their nuclear plans. I mean, the idea that Donald Trump, who wasn't briefed on this, should have done something really bad to the Russians, but we didn't have that same posture toward the Iranians when they were doing this is a little bit questionable. But I think it does just show what you were saying, that this is unfortunately kind of regular behavior for Russia, or not completely outside. It also shows that the intelligence was not substantiated, which is what multiple people on the record have said. Yeah, we heard this. It's not corroborated. It's not substantiated. Once the New York Times reporting fell apart, they tried to claim that it was more corroborated than it was, but you have people on the record saying, we didn't brief it to the president because it's not at that level yet. I think it's interesting that it was, not even 20 years ago, when there was this mad rush to enter the Iraq War, that the media claimed they would do a much better job of resisting claims from intel in the future. And when you look back on what happened in the Iraq War, we were told that it was, an airtight intelligence issue, that Iraq had
slam dunk is what George Tenet said.
Weapons of mass destruction, that it was slam dunk. There was no question. It was totally solid. They had, all this sourcing. And of course, that turned out not only not to be true, it turned out that one of the major claims, that Colin Powell said in his UN address, or that was even mentioned in George W. Bush's presidential address, turned out to be from someone who completely made it up. And you have to acknowledge that intelligence is more art than science, both in terms of collection and analysis. You can think you have a really good source who's telling you something really airtight, slam dunk, and it turns out it's completely invented out of thin air for political reasons. And so you have to be very, very careful when you're running down these things and not, start wars or other things based on something that's not fully checked out.
Yeah, and it's interesting bringing up the Iraq War WMD debacle, because I think that formed, I know it formed kind of my MO for looking at intelligence. I think it does yours as well, where I feel like that experience kind of inoculated us against the whole Russia collusion hoax, that we had lived through a really, really destructive intelligence snafu, and came out of it thinking, you know what, when we're told stuff anonymously by these intel sources who claim things are a slam dunk, we should probably be a little more skeptical of it and demand things like proof and documentation, evidence. I know it's quaint for reporters and people in the news business to demand things like that. And it was actually that instinct that prevented us, almost alone among all of our colleagues in the news industry, from getting duped in this Russian collusion hoax.
I would note that tiny crew of people, of reporters who were skeptical of the Russia collusion hoax that was completely made up, They do tend to share that trait that you just said, though, that a skepticism born from knowledge of history. Because there was a weird coalition of sort of left-leaning journalists, right-leaning journalists, and others who were skeptical because they remembered the lessons from the Iraq War situation. That is not just a coincidence, and I think it's worth pointing out. On the Russiagate story, Senator Grassley said recently that it'll be too late to start prosecutions after the election, so he sure hopes Durham is beginning to hold some people accountable for that complete scandal of the Russia collusion hoax that filtered throughout every intelligence agency, or filtered throughout many intelligence agencies. John Durham is the U.S. attorney who Attorney General Barr put in charge of looking into this Russia collusion hoax. Do you agree with Grassley, and what are your thoughts on the Durham investigation?
I think I do agree with Grassley. I mean, if the point here is to enforce the rule of law and make sure that laws are followed and that our national security is not degraded by criminal, illegal leakers, I'd be happy with indictments coming out the day before the election. I don't really care when justice comes. I just want to know that it comes. But I think Grassley's right that, you know, we're in almost to the middle of July here. We're 4 months from an election. And I think almost by tradition at DOJ, you generally don't see major political prosecutions or indictments come, 6 to 8 weeks before an election. So we're in a window here where if we're going to see results, we need to see them now, because this election, it's not a guarantee Trump wins. I almost think if you were a betting person, you'd bet against him today. And if he doesn't win, I guarantee that all the people who said it was obstruction of justice, if you even say an unkind word about Robert Mueller, will be calling for Durham to be excommunicated and fired and have everything he has been doing shut down immediately. November 5th, Durham's done if Trump doesn't win. So if we actually want to prevent this type of electioneering, this meddling, this foreign interference, recall it was a foreign spy funded by the Clinton campaign, who was at the same time working for a sanctioned Russian oligarch and spreading lies to the media to discredit a political campaign. If you don't want something like that to happen again, everyone involved in that hoax needs to be held to account for what they did. So I like Durham. I think his record speaks for itself. He put FBI people in prison for framing innocent people of murder in order to protect mob informants of the FBI. This is a guy who is not afraid of going after people within DOJ who are corrupt. But my worry now is that the clock is ticking and time is starting to run out. And the consequences if people aren't held to account are going to be grave, because one side of the political spectrum will have learned that they can get away with anything, from foreign meddling to using a soft coup to try and oust a democratically elected president. We simply can't have that happen again and continue as a country.
So I agree with you, but I would just point out that usually that like unwritten code of not prosecuting anyone within a few weeks or indicting anyone within a few weeks of an election refers to candidates themselves. And Barr has said repeatedly that they are not investigating, candidate Trump or candidate Biden, which is interesting because Biden, of course, is involved in this, but he said that they're not targeting Biden, or anything like that, I think, because of for a variety of reasons. So that issue of 6 to 8 weeks before an election doesn't apply in this case. I understand your point, but we should be careful to note that no candidate is accused or is part of this investigation.
For now. I mean, recall that this whole thing started because they launched a spy campaign based on nonsense to spy on presidential campaign advisors. So yeah, you're totally correct, but apparently a lot of these rules don't go both ways. It's a one-way ratchet. You can spy on the bad guys if you're the media or the Democrats or the left, but everything else, you better watch out.
Okay, the other thing I wanted to get your feelings about are whether children should be banned from going to school in the fall, or what you think about this, seemingly absurd notion that children should be banned from school, even though they are not at high risk, or really they're at extremely low risk of either getting the coronavirus or of having problems associated with coronavirus or transmission of the coronavirus. What do you think about that plan?
I think it's completely insane. I mean, children need to be in school. Children need to be with friends. Children need to be outside doing things and learning. And the destruction that is being done to an entire generation of children by banning them from school, banning them from sports, banning them from certain community activities, it's absolutely nuts. I feel like we're through the looking glass, because if you look at the numbers, children are simply not at risk from the coronavirus. The flu is deadlier to children by several multiples than coronavirus is. They're simply not susceptible to this as a group. But we have somehow decided, I use the we ironically, people who weren't elected to do anything have decided that, school is icky and we just can't have kids in school. A cynic might look at it and say that schools are being used almost as a hostage, where they want to keep the economy shut down for whatever reason. And the easiest way for people who want to keep the economy locked down is to ban kids from going to school. Because if they're stuck at home, then you have to have parents at home watching over them and doing online or homeschooling. And I will say I'm awfully cynical of the reasons being put forth. Kids need to be in school. They need to be with their friends. They need to be enjoying sports and doing things outside. And it is criminal that even at this late date, that officials are still discussing banning kids from going to school.
Yeah, I am surprised to see it being taken seriously, given what we know. I mean, it was one thing early on during this outbreak when there was a lot that we didn't know, and there's a question that's with a lot of continuous unknowns. But what we're seeing globally with regard to children is very good news. And in general, during pandemics, you're supposed to make sure that at-risk, vulnerable populations are protected, and people with the illness are quarantined from other people. We've kind of done things exactly the opposite, banning kids from school, but saying to people in nursing homes, like, you're on your own, even though it should be exactly the opposite situation. But it'll be interesting to see how this debate continues in the months to come. And yeah, so anything else, Sean Davis?
Anything else? America's awesome. It's the greatest nation that has ever existed. It's the greatest nation on earth. If you were to ask anyone if you could live in any place in any time in history, and they don't say right now at this very moment, even with all the kind of craziness going on, they're nuts. Because even with all the problems and all the challenges we have, you want to talk about privilege? The greatest privilege on earth is being an American. We can do anything. We can become anything. We can go to the moon. We can send stuff to Mars. This country's awesome. And I just wish we had more people in power, in positions of influence, who were willing to stand up and declare the awesomeness and greatness that is America. Go USA.
Well said. Well, that ends it for this Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Mollie Hemingway, here with Sean Davis. Be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.